Welcome, everyone. Here we are to announce this and celebrate this book by my good friend Steve Chisnell. It's a new book of poetry called Unwoven. I hope that you're watching to find out a few more things about the book and even maybe win a few prizes along the way. So welcome in. Maybe you're someone who loves poetry and wants to find out a little bit more about this book. Maybe you're a teacher or a student who wants to learn more about poetry and about why we use rhythm and rhyme and figurative language. Maybe you're a writer who wants to learn a bit more about how one person's creative process works. And maybe you're just a fan of Steve's and his Waywords Studios, and you want to find out what's going on there. Everyone is welcome, and it's a book launch party. Woohoo! Thank you for coming. My name is Patrick Foley. I've known Steve Chisnell for over 40 years, since we were college students together at Eastern Michigan University, and I'm so delighted to be here today. So what are we going to be doing tonight? Well, we'll tell you much more about Steve's new book, Unwoven, Poetry of Form and Release. You'll learn things about this project tonight that we won't talk about anywhere else. Also, we've got a few prizes to give away to some of you out there. All you have to do is use the links or the QR codes throughout the program to get a chance to win them. And don't worry if you miss one. There will be more chances in the program to click on it. Some of you, who am I kidding? All of you out there want a copy of the book. And we'll tell you how to get copies of all kinds. Print, ebooks, audio, whatever format you are looking for. But along the way, we're going to do some fascinating dives into the making of Unwoven, finding out what it's about, why Steve wrote it, and why you have to have a copy of it in your library. We'll even get some first-time performances from the poems that are in Unwoven. I'd like to tell you more about everything that's going on tonight, but instead, I think it's time that we brought Steve on. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you my good friend, Steve Chisnell, the author of this book.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for dropping in on this video, my version of the book launch party. Frankly, so many of you know me or follow Waywords, they're spread out all over the world that I couldn't imagine some kind of a local pub event. And, all my author friends said a book launch was a non-negotiable. Okay, so be it. Here we are. So, if you're watching live, then know that I am live here too. And I'm happy to answer your questions through the party tonight in the chat. Drop your thoughts, questions, whatever as we go. But most importantly, thank you. I am so grateful for you being here, either live or seeing this a little afterwards in some other time zone. Sharing this small bit of time to learn more about the new book and to support my work means so much. This is all, of course, like it's a new venture for me. After 35 years of teaching, it's like some other passion that I've always carried with me, but have been, for thousands of teaching reasons, prevented from exploring. I have such gratitude to you, my former students and colleagues, for being such a huge part of my life for literally decades. I can't possibly list here all the joys and discoveries, pains and triumphs, embarrassing moments and confidences that have been a part of our relationship, but I can say that these have fed much of the passion that went into this, probably for a few reasons. First, certainly, some of my thinking and experience from those years appears here, and energy and the spirit of exploring meaningful spaces. This book's not a confessional, but what is here still feels true to me. More though, I wrote this in part because so much of what we struggled with together, how meaning happens, what we can do with it, where we find it, fed the inspiration for this book. We're going to talk more about that tonight, I think, but know that I've never stopped thinking about the questions I posed in the classroom for so many years. Two, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to a host of folks who helped make this happen. The Waterford Writers Workshop, my small group of local writers who meet to shred and support one another's writing. Without your input and your challenges, I don't think I would have had the gumption to take these steps to publishing poetry. The very idea for this book is yours. Also, to a host of teachers and other readers, too many to name here, who took on the task of feedback, from the book's structure and choices of poetic forms to very precise and thoughtful critiques of what I've assembled here. And what is that? Well, Unwoven is a book of unravelings. So much of what we experience today feels that way. Our politics and ethical centers, our passing youth into age, our memories that tangle and revise themselves, our relationships of friendship and love, death and absence. What can we hang on to? And don't read this book for answers, but maybe we can find some through a reframing, and if not, at least a sharing of experiences. But what excites me too about this book is a unique approach. Each poem's subject is considered twice. First, I address it in more formal verse. That may be sonnet, haiku, pantoum, ghazal, chant, or ballad. Then, I examine the same subject in free verse, set one against the other. What emerges, I hope, is a new subject, that of poetic structure, of history and tradition, and what it actually meaningfully contributes to the meaning of poetry. Sure, a Sing Cane is a cute 5-liner poem, but does its form do something else besides look cute on the page? Well, yes. For those who know me, you can see what drew me to this project, my first major publication through my Waywords Studio. This is a book of poetry, but its subjects are several, and in the spaces between these poems, book and reader can ask questions about the nature of verse that we rarely get a chance to. And though I am launching this book tonight, there is more to it even than this. From supplemental materials, audio and video, and even later on an online course for the truly inquisitive, all of these are just ahead. But for now, the book, available starting right now in both print and ebook formats. Over the next hour, we're going to learn a lot more what this project is actually all about. And we'll probably give away a few things tonight, too. Thank you for being here.
If you're watching this live and you have access to a chat box, drop your name and give us a shout out. I really want you to use that chat box for questions and comments throughout the program. But wait, what if you're not watching this live, but you're watching this as a recast in some other time zone? Aha! Then check out this intro QR code. Try it out and drop us a message, and we'll respond to you later. If that doesn't work for you, look below for the Introduce Yourself link. It's in the show description below the video. Thank you, and again, welcome. So what's this book about? I'm really excited to introduce to you Dr. Jessica Manuel. Jessica founded a global reading community in 2014. She is the facilitator and guide for passionate readers and thinkers, leading the vibrant community of Book Oblivion. She has taught collegiate reading and writing over the last decade, and now she teaches at the elementary school level, fusing nature study and literature. Her work focuses on helping readers to fall in love with the written word by strengthening their connection to it. Jessica is going to find out just what makes this book so special for Steve and his readers.
Thank you for allowing me to be one of your first readers, because I think this is really neat. I went back and checked. We've been reading together for 6 or 7 years now. Is that about right?
I think that is. I don't like to count, but I think that's
okay. So I think that's incredible. And one of the things that I've seen you do so well for as long as I've known you is follow a thread and follow a narrative thread in every text we read. That is just a skill that you have. So I am elated to see that you call this unwoven and you're looking at unweaving the thread. I don't know. And I would love to hear why you chose that idea, why you chose that topic to kind of narrow in on. And then I have more questions. So let's start there.
Yeah. The title is really interesting. And I chose it early in the project, long before I had finished the work. And once I settled on it, I didn't move. There were no other choices. And I thought that was really interesting. I developed it. I went further with it, but that word just echoed for me in a lot of reasons. And we could go the cliche route and say, all poetry is a tapestry, but that isn't what I was thinking. But I do think the title has a lot of layers to it anyway. Certainly structurally, certainly that's there. The idea that initially you have something like a tightly woven sonnet or a sestina, which has its particular prerequisite strands and patterns that you have to have, and then it comes apart when you move into a more open form or free verse. That's there, and you can see that all the way through. But thematically, there's something else happening. And I think with the speakers through the poems, no matter who they are, they're moving through various stages of extremists as they encounter their experiences, their memories, the people around them, and so I think there's a commentary on it too. The book is divided into 4 pieces that are related around this weaving. There's a tightness, and then there's a rending, which is like a violent tear, and then the threads, which might be some remainder, something to hang on to that's still vital and important. And then finally, of course, there is the full unwoven, what's left of us kind of thing. It's not that the book is despairing, I think, in its themes, but it does take on some topics which are fairly difficult, for its speakers and sometimes for me to wrestle with. So,
So this is a age-old question, right? I've rarely come across a collection of poetry that is so clearly demarcated from the actual poet himself or herself. So you have speakers in each of your poems, and then I also see you. And so, what is your relationship to that writing process?
yeah,
Are you taking on a persona every time? Is that the way you think and write?
uh, no, I won't say it's quite ever so explicit as a division that way, but absolutely, speaker as a role is really important. It has been important for poets forever. I think we limit ourselves a lot by suggesting that all poetry must be the poet's personal angst-ridden or happiness or joys or conflicts. We miss so many literary opportunities there. Ironies and distancing and character, and just like we would for any other text. Not every prose piece is autobiography. So what can we do with it? So yes, I'm very, very conscious of that. But obviously also the text of the poem, the work of the poems come from my own psyche, my own
Mhm.
experiences. There's some educational poems there. There's poems about aging. So obviously I'm wrestling with a little bit of that as well, memory. And so these are things that I wrestle with. But by placing them in another speaker or with another character, it gives me some more freedom to explore them in ways that I wouldn't normally.
As far as the movement, as far as the conflict within the speaker, but also the reader kind of detects that conflict as well in that poem, where you're acknowledging the exchange with your neighbor, where she's not going to hear you. You have no shared soil, you have nothing
Right.
to exchange. And that was kind of despairing. It's kind of depressing, but it's also extremely real. And it marks our moment with like an incredible awareness that hopefully will shift. Hopefully the soils will shift as we,
Mhm.
think through different ideas and we can be better listeners for each other. But I noticed that too. And that sense of certainty where there is no movement, it feels like the answer is constantly being in on that shaky ground, that shifting soil. And you kind of clearly elaborate that throughout. I don't know if you want to say more about that moment.
Um, that poem is probably the most political
Yeah.
I get in the book, and it was a topic I edged into kind of sideways that way. My As a speaker, my face is in the soil. That's where I'm safe.
As a reader, I know what bumper stickers she has on her car.
I know, isn't it?
It's so
And
clearly like the characterization of who she is. I know her like
mhm.
several words.
Yeah, and I found when I was visualizing it in the process, I couldn't dare visualize more than the boots or the feet at down there while I was working. Um, I didn't dare, and because that's just where my head was. Um, because it's so much easier to look at what we can personally grow and fail to grow than to work on those relationships. In the open form of that poem, ends with my knees in supplication.
Yeah.
To what? To
Yeah.
whom? Because I certainly can't appeal to my fellow humans in that case. And so there is that frustration, which is part of that. Ultimately goes back to the theme, part of that rending. Is this what we're up against? I hope not. But like I say, this is the one that got as mostly outwardly political, even though it's a very, very small space that it occurs in.
What strikes me about that, and this is why I think it's such a profound commentary on our political moment, is that it's not about either party at all, as much as it's about just the inability to exchange, to listen, to share soil, to share earth, right? And to be human together. That's what strikes me about that moment.
And even to share the words. The words are identical, between speaker and neighbor, and yet they mean so very different things. Such very different things. So right, even if the language matches, the meaning does not. And that, to me, I was really conscious of that.
Yeah. I think with that too, it's almost as when those people who are unable to listen are in those conversations, it almost feels like sometimes they think everybody else is speaking the same language. It's like they don't know the emperor's naked, and they just think everybody else sees what they see. And that's what gets tricky. I really liked your notes. That was one of the things. I love the idea that the supplement is coming, and the teacher guide and the resources, because that was what I was thinking is I need to go back and get my poetry book. I took a creative writing class in college where we did a lot of these poem forms, and I was able to, so I know them intimately because I've tried them, some of them, not all of them. So what I wanted to do was go back and revisit, okay, what was that supposed to be? Because the formal requirements aren't necessarily in this text. And that was what I was hoping for. So the idea that that's coming is so beautiful. And I love that.
Yeah, I wanted to give enough background on them so that if people wanted just a quick taste of what the form is supposed to be, I could give that. A little bit of inspiration for what this particular poem was about, but not more than that. Because the book itself isn't a teaching tool. It's a book. It's a poetry book. Now, if you want to use it as a teaching tool, then all the supplements are there.
So in that Petrarchy and sonnet, you have that in the notes, you describe the movements between certainty and uncertainty. And I really liked that because I honed in on that theme quite a bit. And I tend to appreciate that in terms of just in the pursuit of wisdom. You even said that in one of the first poems where you said you're more about the search than the warrant. And I really liked that too. That line will probably stick with me forever.
Sorry about that.
No, in a good way, in the best way. I love it. But I mean, it goes back to the etymology of poetry, which is to make. So your idea that it's woven just so it can be unwoven and rewoven, and there are tangles involved, and it's messy and beautiful, and I think it's really neat. I'm really thankful I was able to read this and that you gave me a chance to ask you some questions about it.
Oh, I appreciate it. No, I thank you for doing this. This is fun. I like where we went, what we explored.
Thank you, Jessica, for joining us all the way from California for this interview. And it really sounds like you're doing a great job with the reading community online at Book Oblivion. Those looking to connect with Jessica and her group can find a link in our description below. We really encourage you to reach out. So here is a copy of the book, Unwoven. I've got this white edition right here. It's the one that will be sold globally to just about every retailer that you could imagine. A really clean design that lies about the unweavings going on inside. This cover is designed by Lanette, Koreen. But then so is this cover. The limited edition green cover. This version right here, identical inside, is not available at any retailers. It will be limited to physical appearances only, and it means that it will have to be pretty local. But if you're interested in getting a copy of this limited release version, and not just any version, this is a signed version of Unwoven, here is your first chance. We're giving away 5 copies, 5 signed copies of this limited green edition tonight. You want one? Here's how. On the screen is a new QR code. Use that to sign up for the chance to get one of these signed copies. Like all of our giveaways tonight, the signed copy will exist for only 36 hours. So people around the world can get in on it. Then we'll do a random draw for the winners and send out copies right away. QR code not working for you? Check out the show description for contest links. And this is just one of the smaller prizes tonight. But while you're doing that, let's turn to that poem from the book that Jessica liked so much. Steve is going to do a reading from that poetry pairing for us. It's called Neighbor While Gardening.
Neighbor while gardening. We are in a mental health crisis. I always hate that she includes me in this, but this is not a time for debate. I nod, because what else can I do? I always hate that she includes me in this. I dig at the soil, root beneath the weed, and I nod, because what else can I do? It's not like my words will be heard. I dig at the soil, root beneath the weed, and vow quietly that I will not accept it. It's not like my words will be heard. There is no way to prevent this. Vow quietly that we will not accept it. This is not a time for debate. There is no way to deny that we are in a mental health crisis. Neighbor. She's always presumed to know me. The nods of passion, the performative sorrows, the embracing we of her promulgations, her thoughts and prayers, that I never contradict her. We are in a mental health crisis. She and I, she's right, we certainly are. I never contradict her. Nod in weariness, stir the earth with a hand rake, seek root beneath the weed. Here, in this space, I am silent and unforgiving. My vows are wordless. On what soil would we debate? There's no way to prevent this. I look at her desperate certainty, my knees in supplication.
And this time I've got Steve with me. How are you doing, Steve?
I'm doing really well, Pat. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you being here for this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. The formal version of this poem is called a pantoum, right? What's that about?
I learned a lot about all kinds of forms doing this, a lot more than I knew even when I was teaching. The pantoum goes all the way back to ancient Malaysia as a song form. But when it was brought to Europe, it became this poetic form of moving forward and then moving back. I like to say it moves forward 4 steps and then back 2. That's that repetition of the line. It goes over and over and back, and it pulls. It's good for nostalgia, reflection, and actually people who are caught in a loop.
Oh, I get it. Okay. So why do you use a pantoum for this poem?
I thought it made sense in this one a lot because, well, you've got a speaker who is caught in kind of our polemic rhetoric and political context today, who can't figure out how to have a dialogue. And so the speaker is turning over internally. What's the point? why engage? Why would I say anything? They're not going to hear me anyway. And so instead of a dialogue with the neighbor, it's a dialogue internally with himself.
When you were talking with Jessica, you said that the whole book is basically a collection of pairs of poems like this. Do you think that this poem works better as free verse or as a pantoum?
That's a really good question. When I first started doing this, that was one of the things that a lot of the people in the workshop would do. Is they'd say, which one do you like better? I like this one better. I like that one better. And it's hard, I found, as I did this, because they do different things. What I recognize with a pantoum, for instance, is it does this repeat, this revolution. In the free verse version, it can't do that. It can't do the rotation the same way. So then what does that poem do? It has to do something different. So I get the impotence of the speaker right away, and then the free verse goes somewhere else. It has to, because the structure of the poem of the pantoum has a different idea kind of locked into it. So I'm not sure which one I like better, but I liked discovering what each form and less structured form accomplished.
Okay, makes sense to me. I just think this is fascinating. Hey, I noticed that when we signed up to for one of the signed copies in the green cover, you were asking if we could leave my email for the newsletter. Why do you want my email?
Well, that's a good point. And first of all, the email is going to help me, because if I've got any questions, clarifications, address issues, things like that, I'm going to be able to reach out to you. And that's the easiest way to do it, and probably the fastest. The second one, though, is for the newsletter itself. The newsletter is the way to stay connected to what we're doing, because it's not just the book. We're going to discover as we go through the night that the book is the beginning of what's being offered. There's all kinds of other pieces to find out what they are, to find out how to connect with them, to find out some of the other projects that we're doing in Waywords. That's what the newsletter is about. And if it turns out you don't like it, twice a month you don't like the newsletter, cool. You can unsubscribe whenever you're ready to. But for now, it's our way to find out what's going on. Try it out.
That sounds great. Hey, could I get this book online at some other store that doesn't rhyme with, Glamazon? Where can I get this book?
Yeah, everywhere. That was really important to me, is that wherever you want to order it from, bookshop.org, whatever, Barnes & Noble, whoever you have online that you would like to order it from, it's available right now as print and ebook. You can also order it from me directly on waywordsstudio.com, and you'll see those links down below in the show notes as well. But the point is that I wanted it to be available for everybody, and you can get it any way you want.
I love it. That sounds great. The other day, I understand you were talking with Sarah Ruzanowski about Unwoven and from the teacher's perspective. If it's okay, let's take a moment and put that interview on so that we can learn how much more there is about this book that's in front of us.
Sure, yeah.
Sarah Ruzanowski is a teacher of AP Literature and AP Language and Composition. She did her graduate work at the University of Alabama.
But first, I just wanted to say congratulations on the book, with this being your first book, and that I've been following Waywords, especially the podcast, over the last couple of years, and I've been looking at some of the resources that you have on there for teachers. But I was just wanting to know a little bit more about how this book of poetry relates to the other work that you've done, or maybe how it just connects to Waywords' mission in general.
One of the things that was interesting to me was that for 35 years I've taught poetry, and I've never found any way to teach structure outside of, here, you give the kid a sonnet and you show them that that's what a sonnet looks like, and there's the form, and so they memorize the rules, so they'll recognize it next time they see it. And that's as far as it goes. I mean, in terms of structure anyway. We look at individual sonnets, but we never understand why the sonnet. What is the structure doing for it, and why did the sonnet writer choose that form? And so one of the things that comes out of that is that question of what happens when you put the two next to each other. And can you now, if the poems are the same poem, basically subject-wise, what's the only thing to inquire about? The structure. How did the structure change those things? And so now we've got a book here that is actually showing those two next to each other. And I think that's fairly unique in terms of, what is offered to students. So they don't have to worry about the flashcards of rules. They just look at what is happening. And it's in the space in between those poems that they get to ask that question and figure out how the meaning changed, when practically the only thing different is the structure.
Yeah. Well, I think that you make a great point that there really isn't anything out there like this where you can look at two poems that are getting at a similar message and laying them next to each other like this. And as teachers, we want our students to understand. And I think one of the hardest things to teach with poetry is helping students understand, how does the structure of the poem inform its meaning or affect its meaning. But it's hard to really, I think that this shows them that in such a unique way, where you just completely strip the poem of that structure and then look at, are these now the same poems? How are they different? How is the meaning affected? So I think that's great. And just speaking of, all of this, it sounds like from the beginning you had this in mind as a teaching tool, or did it start out as just a personal project and evolve into something that could be used for teaching?
Well, I guess yes and no. Yes, it's always been in my head, I guess, somewhere. But no, I was originally just writing poetry, and I wanted to experiment with form myself. I wanted to know what was going on with form, what I could do with my own writing with it. And so for me, it was a training on its own. But then, we get into the workshop and people are talking about what happens if you do this, what happens if you do that. And it started to build from there. And then the question came, you should do a whole bunch of these. Well, once that happened, then I was writing, I think, with a little more intention, a little more purpose for the idea that maybe there's something that fits Waywords. And it certainly seemed to once I started thinking about it. I said, my gosh, this is doing a little bit of everything that I like to do. So, yeah, absolutely. A lot of. I don't think anything comes out of one source. It comes out of lots.
Okay, gotcha. Well, are there any forms that, now that you've created all of these different poems and used all these different structures, are there two that you think would be maybe fun to juxtapose or look at next to each other?
Oh, man. And this is what I've discovered as I was writing. I didn't imagine when I wrote haiku that I would be thinking about it in the same way as sonnet. For instance, haiku is, we talk about it in 5-7-5, don't we? Do, 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 do. And we're all clapping together even now as we think about it. 5-7-5. I don't want to throw shade on elementary school teachers, but it's their fault. And they're doing it because they want to teach syllable structure. I get that. But all of the Western world now is thinking 5-7-5 and haiku. The Japanese alphabet doesn't work that way. The Japanese alphabet is very different from the English alphabet. So they don't even have syllable structure in that same way, let alone the 5-7-5 lines, the 3 lines. So our concept of haiku is completely different. What we need to understand about haiku is it's a very efficient, compact, condensed, objective imagery where you've got 2 lines that are set up to offer an objective nature image, a very present moment image of a season or a time, and then a turn, a shift, where that 3rd line is juxtaposed in a way that surprises perhaps or opens up possibility. But the important part about it in that kurege, the turning word, the cutting word for the poem, which, by the way, English doesn't even have a word like this. So in English we use dashes, spaces, even just the line break to show that cutting or that volta turn that's the same as in the sonnet. You have a condensed poem of beauty that turns. And in that turn, everything opens up. Mm. Now, if I were going to say the same sentence, but I was going to say it was in a sonnet, it would be the same. Very condensed, 14 lines, very tight. Every word, every syllable counts. It's a poem of tight beauty. And there's a turn at some point in that sonnet, and then it opens up. And in that case, you've got 2 poems that are functioning exactly the same way structurally. And that, I think, is a much more refreshing way to understand what poetry is up to than to say 575, or 14 lines iambic pentameter. I can count it and answer C, on the quiz. So that's kind of the thing I'm thinking about there. So those are fun to juxtapose, to put together. And you can do it a lot of different ways. But there's all these ties between these poems that are structurally unique. Even the cinquain works at some level that way, that we just typically don't think about.
And as you were saying, like the use of the cutting word or the volta, kind of looking at those next to each other could be really interesting. But you would never, I would have never thought to place a haiku next to a sonnet. So that is really fun.
Yeah, me either. And I think that's one of the things that I discovered as I loved writing this book because of that. I discovered so much about structure myself that, all my lifetime I've spent time around literature, and yet I'm still learning things. How awesome is that? But why did I have to wait to this age, and why do we all? So yeah, I thought this was a nice way in, and I love the discoveries that come not from prescription, like prescription lesson plans and things like this, but just open possibilities, lots of different pieces that you can put together, assemble the way you want to assemble them as a teacher. Now I'll give you some ideas here and there, but for the most part, all the pieces are here. Put them together any way you want, and then discover something. That's fun.
I want to go back for just a second to talk about just as I was reading, some of the poems really struck me as ones that I would enjoy teaching the most. And one of them, I thought, I'm going to be teaching all seniors this year. And I was thinking that if there gets to be a point in the school year, which I'm sure there will be, where students need a little more of a nudge or kind of a re-inspiration to learning for learning's sake, the one section of the book that seems like maybe it belongs the most in a classroom space was the section on education. So I'm thinking about the poems Righteous, Education, and Yes, Young Man, I Wish You'd Studied More, which all kind of invite those questions into the nature of learning and the nature of what is true learning versus those extrinsic motivations for learning. So do you see those as poems that you think belong in the classroom space, or are they more commentaries on the classroom and learning? How would you maybe encourage teachers to use those poems?
Yeah, I guess I would agree. They're both. I mean, I think there's a lot to be gained from understanding the nature of the educational space. There's a lot of transactional stuff that happens in education, and it was hard for me with my teaching background not to write about something like this. But absolutely, they can be used. And I think one of the things that it catches me about And Yes, Young Man, which is blank verse, what that does, I guess teenagers have this image of a lot of teachers as being, full of themselves, know-it-alls, and perhaps stuffy as well. Well, what's interesting is the blank verse fulfills that a little bit by making everything iambic pentameter. Suddenly we're taking that tone and we're just shoving it up a couple degrees. And if you wanted to think of it as a stick being shoved up a couple degrees, that's fine too. But there's a teacher monologue going on there, and the blank verse it's a monologue in this case. No matter how effective that teacher is, no matter how much they know, notice in that poem, there's no space for the student at all. He's not saying a word. Doesn't get a chance.
Yep. The conversation about learning is not much of a conversation.
Nice dialogue for that one-on-one conversation, isn't it? And there's a fair amount of that going on. And it happens lots of different ways. It can happen with the pomposity of this kind of teacher who, even if he has the right idea, we should be pursuing the why. We should be getting into the noble epistemology of learning. But even if he's got that right, everything else shuts it all down. And it happens, again, through the pomposity, of course, the tone of that poem. It happens from the silencing of a student who doesn't feel they have the right to intercede in it. And so where is that space? So we go looking elsewhere. And I guess the cinquain that's out there, the little girl who avoids the school issues and decides to learn on her own, finds a different way to do it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of ways to do it, but the poems aren't offering answers. They're just complicating the questions, which is half the fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess if there was one poem that you had to pick to share out, and especially I'm sure that when you're sharing this with groups that might use this in the classroom, is there one or two poems that you might suggest using as like an intro, or one that you think that you would enjoy starting with?
I think I'm going to surprise myself a little bit and say, yeah, I think I'd start at the beginning. The opening poem is ZaniLa, which is such an unusual form of poetry. Unusual in that it's fairly new. Invented just about 40 years ago, maybe, by a little-known poet who has invented a lot of different forms. And this is what's happening in the circuit of the amateur and semi-professional poets, is they're out there experimenting. So ZaniLa is a poem that you can almost guarantee as a teacher nobody's run into. What's good about that is that suddenly no one is coming in with a lot of expectations about what poetic structure is about. Go ahead, start with a sonnet if you want to, but the moment you say sonnet in that classroom, all the students go, "Oh, sonnet," and they want anything to do with it. And now you got to jump over that hurdle to get them back in the right zone of being appreciative of what it is they're going to experience. ZaniLa has no expectations, and it's a really easy access structure. It's very obvious to see what its rules are about. So that gives us a chance that for the students, for the class, to figure out, what is this structure doing? What is it? How does it function? What is it doing for the poem itself? Is it lending some gravitas to the poem? Is it emphasizing something? Is it showing some obsession? What's it up to? But guess what? You can't Google it. You're not going to find Cliff's Notes out there. There's nobody that's going to tell you that right now. So now you've got a poem structure to look at that's easy to get into, easy to talk about, sets up the whole discussion of the book, and no expectations. So this starts us off right away by saying, what is the structure for? Instead of asking, what are the rules of the structure? So we get back to that same idea again. And that's why I think I'd start right away with the first poem.
I guess my last question is just, do you have any other suggestions for how teachers might use this collection, and especially use of those additional supplements, or just anything else you want teachers to know?
I should probably talk about exactly what it is you're getting that way. There's all kinds of pieces. First, there's annotated versions of everything that's in Unwoven. There's also master poets, Edna St. Vincent Millay and Shakespeare and Wordsworth and all the heavy hitters and doing their work. And I've grabbed 2 or 3 of every form of poem out there and done an analysis of those for teachers as well, so they can see how Unwoven's poems work the same or differently from some of the established masters. There's questions on the poems and comparing and contrasting them. There's essays that go into the poems even further, and all of that's there. What's going to follow in October is a teacher's guide, which will have all those things assembled, plus some of those patterns I was talking about, some of the implementation strategies that you might want to try, some things not to miss, some ways to decode poems. One of the things I have is a toolbox, kind of, that if a student runs into a poem, they don't recognize the structure, they don't know what to do with it, here's some techniques to try out on that poem to see if they can unlock it a little bit and find out what's going on with it. And then down the road, there's even an online course for students who aren't connected to a classroom experience that way, or for teachers who want to send students there for supplemental work. It's all there. Video, audio talks are there. Video and audio readings of the poems are here. And I should finally mention, too, that the copyright of this book is about as open as I can make it. It's a Creative Commons copyright for educators. As long as you're giving credit to the author, and that would be me, and you are not using it for commercial purposes, you are welcome to do anything you want with it. Right? Chop it up, move it around, and the same with the supplements, which are even more broadly protected. Just use them for the classroom any way you want. Things are hard enough without you worrying about something that's been copyrighted or someone's going to hunt you down. So that's all there for teachers,
awesome.
absolutely free.
Well, I'm excited to take a look at that stuff. And especially, I mean, with this being my first year teaching AP Lit, there are already a couple of poems that I've looked at and thought, I don't know if I would have even thought to teach this form, but now it's in my calendar, so I'm excited.
So all of these supplements are available right now?
Yes, in digital form they are. So if anyone who's getting the newsletter, I have the email for, I can get them those supplements in digital form, PDFs and such, as they want them.
It's wonderful. But there's also a huge teaching guide to poetry structure that you're making available. When? October?
Yes, that's taken a little longer. It actually evolved from a lot of the teachers who I've been speaking to who want more than merely the supplements that are there. They want some ideas for application to classroom, strategies, things like this. So I'm going to take all those digital pieces, put them in a printed form, supplement that with lesson ideas, not lesson plans. Let everyone do their own thing.
Right.
But lesson ideas, discussions, opening, ways to get into and apply these things as they want to their specific classrooms. And that'll be a printed book, spiral bound, available in October from the website Waywords Studio.
You have been a busy man.
It feels like it.
How much will this cost?
We're working on the pricing right now. The big and most important thing is I want this stuff to be accessible to people. So obviously when you're doing a book that's a print book of some kind, there's a price involved. Yeah. A spiral bound book, that's a little pricier. That's why I have the PDFs and the digital version, so I can keep pricing low, free for almost everything that I put out there. And some of the stuff that's a little more labor intensive might have a smaller cost to it.
Sure. That's excellent, Steve. It's just another reason why we should sign up for the newsletter, isn't it?
That's right. Because the other thing about that newsletter I'll mention too, that's where sometimes discount codes come from. So if you're thinking, I'll just wait for it to be on Barnes and Noble or Bookshop, okay, you can do that. But if you're part of the newsletter, you might also find discount codes and other ways to receive package deals and things like that through the newsletter.
Sure. You know, it sounds to me like a great idea for another prize. So for all of you watching tonight or later, if you're a teacher or a student of literature, or if you know either of these people, we're going to give away another prize. We're going to give away 2 printed teacher's guides free tonight. That's right. Here's that QR code again. And listen, if you're already signed up and you're thinking, yeah, I want a copy of that too, no worries. Just use that QR code again or the link below for another chance. While you're doing that, we want to give you something else to listen to. Am I right, Steve, that you brought a music video?
Yeah, you can call it that. Oh. Some time ago, I got involved with the Book Oblivion project with Jessica, a creative reading project. Basically, me creating music from literature inspiration sources. Wow. So from that project came one of the poems in Unwoven. So what I want to do is show this video that's got one of the poems from Unwoven in it, and then you can see some of its inspiration, where it really came from. But you'll also see some music from Waywords and some of the literature inspiration that is just kind of in the background of my head that you're not going to find in the printed book at all. But you get to see where I came from in the producing of that video. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. I got to admit, that's not the kind of thing I was thinking I would expect for a poetry book,
Yeah, that's true. And I got to say, one of the things I surprised myself with Waywords now is that I thought I'd be going in, writing some fiction, writing some essays, doing some instructional things. And I recognized that the multimedia part of it has just really grown in a lot of ways. So I'm producing my own music. I'm producing my own audio with the podcast. I'm doing all kinds of things that I wouldn't have expected otherwise. So people who visit the website are going to see not just writing, but a multimedia blitz of things that are just pouring out of my head, basically.
Oh, very cool. Well, so here's the video from last year's original concept. He lifts a quiet finger at his world.
so he fell upon the claying soil. Months of care washed away in the downpour, squeezed its spongy flesh with calloused fingers. And so, if the neighbors peered from their cool bay windows, he would not know. Phlox and willow, vervain and balm, vanished. A rubber soaker hose lay uselessly. Always next year, she said to him, some time this morning, some time ago. And so, to plow it all over, to rip it out, to expunge the vows, the sacrifice, the act. He cursed his idealism, his impotence. And so, a lawn boy across the street belched on sod. The ortho man parked his truck down the block. The orange tall weeds and grass citation still decorated his door. He reached. That evening, that autumn, that generation, he let the dried plants lie. He turned the clay with mulch, brought the survivors in to shelter winter, buried bulbs deep in November mud, lifted a quiet finger at his world, penciled a planting map, dreamed of wasp and monarch, left the muck beneath his nails, awaited the next calamity, made his vows against the gods.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. If you want to see that again, you can rewind it, of course, but the entire video series of works is available at our link below. So let's see. There's a newsletter out there that people should sign up for. Yep. And so
Absolutely.
far, we're offering 5 signed copies of the book and the 2 copies of the teacher's guide. That's awesome. While I turn that over, let's not lose track of what we just saw. Steve is talking with Kelly Porter of New Orleans about the process of creation, structure, the creative process. Kelly C. Porter is a PhD candidate in American history at Tulane University. She's the head archivist for Preservation Hall, a historic jazz venue in New Orleans, community organizer and public historian, and not least, one of Steve's former students from literally another century ago.
That's right.
What did you learn about maybe both your free verse and some of those formal poems, or those forms that you were using, by that process of picking them apart and revoicing them in free verse?
One of the things I found exciting, because I really wrestled with this idea, in order to focus on the structure, which was really my goal. I wanted to put the structure at the front, at the forefront. And that's what the facing poems were intended to do. But then I asked, the other question is, so am I just going to use the exact same words and one of them is going to be in, meter and the other one is not? Is it going to look that way? And I didn't think that was fair to either form. So, for instance, if I created a villanelle, its form is pretty much there for me to work with, and so I created the villanelle. But now, if I just did the free verse without like the repetition, what am I accomplishing? So, what I needed to do is understand that open form poetry, of which free verses is one type, open form poetry is itself structured, does itself have rules and possibilities and spaces. And I would do open form an injustice if I didn't explore its spaces.
Okay.
So I think there are opportunities and there's meaningful differences in each poem. One of the things I've discovered when you talked about revoicing was that some people look at the two and they say, which one do you like better? But then they look at the two and say, oh, I didn't understand what this line was, but now that I read it over here, it makes more sense.
Right.
And
there's a notion that one decodes the other or something.
Right. And that really wasn't my intention. And I can understand the gesture, the readerly gesture that does that, because they're right there to talk to each other. So great. But I wasn't really writing them with the notion that they were the same poem precisely, because of those differences of opening up and revealing. In the elegy that we were talking about just a moment ago, the differences are stark.
Some are definitely more different than others. Some feel very close, and then some feel worlds apart. That's definitely one of the ones that's on the latter part of the spectrum.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, not just because I did a point of view change, but I think the very nature of it, it revealed itself in the formal poem in a way that I didn't have in the free verse poem. So yeah, I think there is a lot that. Now then it goes to, are these simply different versions of the same poem? And the answer is they can't be, right? Every structure, every incarnation, every rereading makes a different poem. I
just got textual theory on
it does. I will.
This notion of like strictness and looseness within form. The notion, is it really a sonnet if one couplet is a slant rhyme? Is it really, the sort of a very binary, very all or nothing approach to formalism, where it has to follow exactly a particular stricture or a particular poet's, example and use of that form. And there are some places where you do that in this collection, where you adhere very closely to a very prescribed form, and then there are some where you're taking a few of your own liberties. And yeah, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, of just like, if it's 75% a villanelle, is it still a villanelle? That sort of approach to it, and maybe how we can kind of like take some of that, that strictness, that tightness out of formalism, when you do realize, as you just said, you make your own rules. You can decide where to make and break with structure.
And I think historically, that has always been the case. None of these forms, as they originated, which is to say the earliest version of them that we have, that's in writing, it has remained static across history. It's always changed as it moves from country to country, as it moves from the highest court to the rural village. Wherever they were used, they changed. And so I would say this about form. To your question of, is it a villanelle if I vary the repetition and that sort of thing, it's where structure varies from tradition that the poem is in dialogue with that tradition. I'm thinking of two cases. The first one is a very particular one, is that even Shakespeare, for instance, violated his own sonnet rules over and over and over and over again. He has one 15-line sonnet. What are you doing, Will? But he did it, right? But why? Why does he change his iambic pentameter here and there? Why did he use a slant rhyme or an off rhyme when he could have been more on point? And that has everything to do with drawing our attention to a structure shift, a tonal shift, a weakness or a flaw in the ability of the poem to communicate, a breaking of the speaker tone. There's 1,000 reasons why poets break structure rules. And so the first thing we do as readers is say, I know what the tradition says, but it didn't happen there. Why not? And in you go to figure out why this poet decided that this wasn't going to play the way of history. So the beauty of the form is disrupted in some way.
Sure.
So that's the first reason for variation. The second one, I think, is far more interesting. And we see that in almost every non-white, non-Western poet who looks at these structures and, of course, varies them. Because that is a direct, sometimes post-colonial, sometimes racial response to the institutional structure that has been laid out for them. And then it's the acquisition of that structure, the turning of it and making it the poet's own, which is fascinating. There's so many fascinating poets out there that are doing that. I'm thinking of Kathy Park Hong in particular is in my head right now, but there are so many that are doing great work with that. It's at a point where if I decided to write a 7-syllable poem and called it sonnet, am I wrong? Who's to tell me I'm wrong, right? But even calling it that demands something of the reader. That's to say, signal to the entire tradition, now deal with this and put the poem in front of you. So I think there's a lot of excellent dialogue to be had in contemporary poetry now based upon that question you're asking. What's that role of structure? Well, we're always in dialogue with history.
Sure. I mean, you're playing with your readers' expectations at that point as well, because you have a form to break. You can easily draw attention anywhere you want simply by making the break. The elegy in particular, but to some extent poetry in general, being the public performance of a very private act or a very private set of feelings. In the case of the elegy, grief. But I mean, poetry in and of itself, regardless of the formalism of its structure, is a place where, it's one of the most vulnerable, forms of human writing, I think. So yeah, I was kind of curious with you about what it meant for you to explore some of these things and this notion of like the public performance of, in the case of the elegy, personal grief, but just more broadly, the public performance of, your own interiority, your own thoughts, especially as a teacher. I was going to say that's not something that you usually get to share with your students very often.
You're right. As a teacher, there's always been that kind of there's a formality, a creation of a persona that rightfully appears trustworthy, honest, compassionate, that kind of thing, and yet still holds back because you're in a public persona space. So the teacher is never quite the whole human. I think that's true of most writers as well, of the elegy. And I've had people push back, some of my earlier readers push back on that and said, no, you can just read the poem as a poem of grief and be fine. I don't disagree. You can read an elegy as a poem of grief and get a great deal out of it. But that is not the full story of the elegy. It's not the complete reading of it. Not that there is anything called complete. To pretend that I'm going to take the rawest emotion, grief, and say, okay, I'm throwing it out into the world. Usually it would reveal itself as sobbing, agony, screams, hair pulling, whatever you want to do. But no, you've asked me to cautionarily put it into a prescribed tradition of form, which has 3 distinct pieces to it. I must show my agony in part 1. I must idealize the subject who I'm grieving over in part 2. I must come to some reconciliation and acknowledgement of moving forward in part 3. And if I don't do that, I haven't created a traditional elegy suitable for the historical public. We're truly misunderstanding elegy if we forget that that separation is there. This is not the heart on the countertop. This is the heart on the countertop packaged in a very nice bow that's presentable and not too ill-mannered, right, for the people who are reading it at the time.
Well, I think you're talking about the performance of authenticity on some level, right? How do you perform authentic grief? Yeah, like it can be very meta on some level. Well, as I was saying before, congratulations, you wrote a book. Yay, you wrote a book.
Yeah, somehow or other it happened.
Whew. There's a lot going on in your head about this, isn't there, Steve?
I think I keep discovering that every time I produce one thing, 5 or 6 other huge questions get in my head about what I want to do next and how I want to produce something next to explore a different idea. So yeah, it gets me kind of, messes my head after a while.
Sure it does. Hey, what's on the horizon, Steve? What are you going to do after this?
It's a good question too. I think the first thing is we're getting the podcast Literary Nomads. That's coming back. I'm finishing that up and rebranding it. So we're going to create the new podcast. But then I've got a lot of other projects. This thing has got me really thinking about what else I can produce. But also, not surprisingly, a lot of the teachers I've interviewed about this book have already asked for other kinds of projects of a similar vein, whether in fiction or anywhere else. And so I'll be looking at doing some of those as well. Great. There's so much ahead. I'm trying to figure out how to prioritize right now.
Wow. And I'm listening to it. But it's so cool that Waywords Studios is settling in on getting started with this book, Unwoven, that so clearly fits your passion for writing, for teaching, for building literacy.
I've been really happy about it. I kind of backed into the project accidentally. I didn't expect I'd be producing a book this year, and yet here I am. I didn't expect I'd be producing a poetry book this year, and yet here I am. So I'm excited by all of that. But mostly, once I started to see it come together, and it does all these things that are my goal for this business, and the business being of helping people learn and read critically. once I recognized that, I said, "Oh, this is a slam dunk. We got to do it."
Steve, can we ask you to read one more poem? How about that one about Trillium?
Yeah, we can do that one. That's a pastoral poem. It closes the book, and it comes in 3 versions. In fact, there is a pastoral poem, which is basically a nature poem, an anti-pastoral poem, which pushes back against the nature poem, and then what we call a post-pastoral, which does something different with human experience and nature. So yeah, I can show you all 3 so you can see the versions. The Trillium. Still now, beneath this somber leaf where beetle grooms, from sun relief emerges silent, green and frail, this trillium bud the earth exhales. From damp this birth its peering reach will slip to dappled sun, and breach past autumn's crumbled legacies, bright breath made from memories. And opens now white trinity, wake robin of sanguinity, a balm for marrow deepening cold, that near ahead awaits us gold. In meantime, chase the air and light, in ant and soil find rich delight. These moments gifts from lifetimes past, and nature's span is virile, vast. For briefest bloom our courses are, as witnessed by the eyes afar. Then soft or sudden, in love or sin, sweet inhalation folds us in. Trilliums. What blight is this? And what of the deer now eaten? My only 2 specimens of Trillium grandiflorum left, protected by chicken wire, each with microplasma parasites. And who knows if the ravaged ones will ever recover. 4 years. Rhizomes, $25 each, 3/4 inch deep. Compost and peat moss, under earth drip irrigation, beer traps for slugs, aluminum sulfate to adjust, now they say it poisons kids, ammonium sulfate to adjust pH, all in raised cedar boxes, mulched oak leaf, in dappled sunlight. The price of beauty, yeah? One bloom opens, nice enough, as photographed for IG through zinc-coated steel wire, and there it will remain while it lasts, hands off, too fragile to preserve this wild. But its image, 4 minutes, 24 megapixel, 1 cropping, AI foreground object removal, 3 filters, tweet highlights and depth, portrait mode enhanced, hand-blended resolution noise to 8%, tagged, stored, and posted, archived in resolution greater than the eye can see. Trillium. It's silly, really, my speaking with you now, after all of this. And what offering, mutual and co-opted, misremembered but virile, stipule to apex, inscribed and unraveled, a leap across white or air to sub-discovered touch, myrmecoquery and smattering of marks left on a sofa or a staircase to a bedroom, on screen or fibrous strophial, thread of portent, its seed pinched for ripeness, might briefly yield poem. We grow by our rules, name by our prunings. Who can be faulted for leaving? By what faith is kept abound? When the we is really you and I weep, to exhaustion lean, yearn without prayer, misread and moon, lift my fingertips, abide in wakefulness, sessile and pedestal, sights and mannerisms for change, fecund in suffocating earth, bloated and bibulous, yielding back only what is pressed, strained or pulped, refined or fermented, but fleeting always, each sip a revision of mood, pedal or pistol re-evolved, not myself knowing what next I will mean. Do not keep me here. Don't leave me here.
I'm going to need to see that one in print. So much going on there. But we're nearing the end of the program tonight, and I think we need to give away a few more prizes. And this next thing is pretty unique. Steve is clearly an expert at what he does. He's been teaching at high school and colleges for over 35 years. He's been writing for decades, and he's clearly thinking about literacy. And maybe you viewers would like to have some of that expertise for your own. So what we're going to do is we're going to offer you a 1-hour Zoom call with Steve for just about any of these topics. How you use your hour is more or less up to you. Maybe you're a teacher with a classroom that wants to learn more about poetry and needs a guest speaker. Maybe you're a writer or a student who wants to have some feedback for their work. And maybe you're a researcher who wants a great primary source in writing or literature from an expert. The point is, you decide how you want to use that hour. If you win, Steve will contact you and work out all the details later. But this is a 1-hour guest speaker or consultation with the author, educator, podcaster, Steve Chisnell. And here's that QR code one more time for that opportunity. Already signed up for earlier contests? That's okay. Go ahead, do it again. That's right. You can enter these contests 3 times for the books, for the teacher's guide, and now for the personal consultation. Hopefully, everybody by now, and I mean everybody, has surely signed up for that newsletter so that you can find out more about Waywords projects, bonus opportunities, coupons, early releases, whatever Steve's next book will be. Steve?
Thank you, Pat, my friend, for these many decades. You know, when I went thinking about the people who had the biggest hearts to support my efforts, you were the first choice. And I'm so happy that you could make this whole thing happen. Also, of course, I need to give deep bows of appreciation to the 3 interviewers tonight. Jessica, who has, with her Book Oblivion community, taught me that academic rigor is found in earnest inquiry. I can't wait to see what these next years will find us, and with 2025 in your Horizons program. To Sarah, who's beginning her long career with AP Literature, my best wishes, my support, my jealousy that I cannot do it all again. May you have as many challenging and energizing years teaching as I have had. And to Kelly, who left my classroom 25 years ago, I'm so thankful that we have sustained our friendship for these years. Your own poetry, your own politics, your own studies are so in sync to my own ambitions. I wonder who's looking up to whom now. You know, it's impossible to have been a teacher myself for so long and not have been hugely influenced by my own students and teaching colleagues. And so for all those who watched me for decades write random language experiments in verse on blackboards and whiteboards and overheads and monitors and typewriters, only to erase them and say, it doesn't matter, I can always write more later. I'm happy to report I'm writing more, even if later. Thank you for providing me a fun and challenging 35-year-long practice space. Locally, another shout out to the W3, the Waterford Writers Workshop here in Michigan, that both sparked the idea of Unwoven and waded through so many poetry pairs across several months. Thanks especially to poet William Teets for his provocations and thorough critiques. Thanks, Bill. You know, along the same lines, a cadre of teachers and writers across the country were valuable for a variety of insights, specific and general, as this project came together. But a special acknowledgement and thanks to Wesley Leiden at the Choral Academy of Science High School in Reno for some of the most thorough and thoughtful feedback I could have asked for. Now, he calls it nerdiness. I have to call it expertise. From poetic structure right down to the length of dashes, my exchanges with Wesley helped me re-see a great deal. Cover art for Unwoven, for both editions, was done by Lanette Koreen, and it was a world of difference between her professional design and my amateurish photo manipulation. I love the designs, and I thank you. 2, all the incidental music you heard tonight, the Waywords theme music, the other pieces, are compositions of Random Miles, who is also doing the incidental music for the audiobook. Find more about his music in the notes below. Thank you for your creative energy. Behind the scenes is my partner Jen, who literally helped me build and design Waywords Studio and has so valued the space we created and the work I do in it. I couldn't ask for a better space for the projects ahead. Yes, this is my first book, and for that reason alone, it is important to me. But more than this, Unwoven has done a few things for me too. It taught me, first of all, that my own learning of writing craft can be realized in something tangible for others. And that's no small thing, especially for someone who's sometime back in the 1970s believed that he might have a few books in him. More, it has itself woven together my passions, creative writing and education. It's also given me the impetus to do quite a bit more. As important as it's been for me, I hope you find it valuable as well. 35 poems, nearly a year of work and still going, and now we look to getting it into the hands of any who might find that in different ways it speaks to them. Buy it, gift it, make whatever use of it you can, and if you find it worthwhile, let me know by writing a review or by writing to me. If not, let me know that too. Tell me how I can make it valuable for you, or tell me what I should do next. Thank you for being here, for joining this little launch party. Thank you for sharing the premiere of this, my first book. Thank you for inspiring me to complete this book. Good night.
Well, dang, folks, that's about it. This has been a real treat for me. I hope each of you has found our brief time together truly worthwhile, and that it's been a fun time for you as it has been for me. Thank you so much for showing up. So here's your final checklist to be sure that you've taken advantage of everything we've talked about tonight. Hopefully you've learned a lot about Steve's new book, his first, Unwoven, Poetry of Form and Release. Now available at waywordsstudios.com and just about every other online retailer. Or just go to your local bookstore to tell them to get one for you, because supporting your local bookstores is cool. You absolutely signed up for the prizes at our contest link. Here's that QR code one final time to get connected at all the prizes we offered. And you can enter 3 times. Now to be clear, the contests are available for the next 35 hours or so. Once the launch party video goes private, the contests are closed and we'll determine the winners. They'll be announced in an upcoming Waywords newsletter. That means you signed up for the newsletter too, right? You'd better. And if you haven't checked out all the links that we have in the description for Waywords, for Steve's socials, for all the amazing guests that we've had tonight, do that right away. They're good people, and good people need to stay in touch with each other. So once again, I'm Patrick Foley. It's been my pleasure to work with Steve on this wonderful book launch program. I'm sure that you're going to love the book, Unwoven. Good night. Let's roll those credits.